Kia ora koutou and welcome back to the Early Childhood Seminar Series. We're very pleased to be here with you and to be able to share another Early Childhood Seminar, our third for 2020-21. The focus of the seminar series this year is on showcasing research of staff and students from the faculty, and we're excited to share with you the work that they've been doing. Our next seminar will be on October the 18th with myself, Justine O'Hara-Gregan, and Natalie Hopper sharing from our research studies exploring teacher wellbeing. We also have one final presentation for the year in November, when Maria Cooper and Louise Gorst will be sharing their research on leadership in early childhood education. Today, we're delighted to have with us Amanda White and Joanna Williamson with their seminar focusing on connecting and communicating through stories. The recording of this presentation will be available on our Early Childhood Seminar Series YouTube channel after the seminar. If you have any questions during the presentation, please do use the Q&A function to ask them, and Joanna and Amanda will respond to them at the end of their presentation. Without further ado, I would like to pass over to Helen Hedges to introduce our guest speakers.
Kia ora, Justine. Kia ora koutou. Ngā mihi nui, haere mai ki tēnei hui. It's certainly my delight to introduce both our presenters today. They're both currently PhD students in the faculty researching children's languages and literacies development. Joanna's undertaken her research with teachers and young children, and Amanda with teachers, families and toddlers. Amanda lives in Wellington with her family, so she's very familiar with this Zoom thing that we're all getting a bit more used to. She had a career as a speech language therapist here in New Zealand and in other countries before becoming a full-time PhD student. Amanda enjoyed her career, but she also became curious about what else there might be to know about the contexts of children's languages development from sociocultural and ecological perspectives. Joanna lives in Auckland with her family. After a career as an English teacher in secondary schools in New Zealand and other countries, Joanna and her husband became owners of 2 early childhood centres. So Joanna obtained her graduate diploma to support that venture, which has gone very well because both centres have been well praised by ERO during reviews. So Joanna's interest in language and learning, of course, has continued through to her current studies. Oral languages and literacy have always been a priority amongst that top 5 in practice and in policy, and probably in parents' aspirations as well. So fortunately, both Amanda and Joanna had their intensive field work completed before the pandemic affected our lives in New Zealand. So they both have really thoughtful and insightful findings and ideas for your consideration and application today. So we look forward to your presentations, and I'll hand over to you, Amanda. I believe you're starting. Thank you.
Thanks, Helen. Tēnā koutou katoa, ko Amanda White tuku ingoa, ngā mihi nui kia koutou. And I'm really looking forward to sharing some insights from my research into children's story experiences with you today. I'll hand over to Joanna.
Kia ora tātou, ngā mihi nui kia koutou. I'm Joanna, and I'm going second, but I'm looking forward to sharing some of the things that I've found out during this process as well. So see you soon.
Okay, so today we're going to be presenting on connecting and communicating through stories and supporting languages and literacy through relationships. And as we said earlier, drawing on both of our doctoral research studies.
We're storytelling creatures, and as children we acquire language to tell those stories that we have inside us. Jerome Brunner was an American cognitive psychologist who worked with the roles of culture and social experiences alongside the Western uptake of Vygotsky's work in this area. He was interested in the meanings that humans created out of their encounters with the world and what meaning-making processes we employ. He advocated for the importance of narrative and making sense of the world through stories as key to meaning-making. Today's kaupapa is, as you've been explained, the 2 of us presenting. But first and foremost, we're going to start with explaining what we mean when we say literacy in stories in the early years. Following that, Amanda will present her insights from her PhD, and then I will do so from mine. We'll save all the Q&A till the end of our presentations, both of our presentations. However, if you wish to write a question or comment in the chat during the presentations, while it's top of mind, then do so and we can address it at the end. So what do we mean when we say early literacy and literacies? Essentially, we see literacy as communication in all its forms, and all communication as social. Vygotsky foregrounded the interconnection of language and thinking, proposing that all higher mental functioning, that is, all complex learning, occurs within a dialogic encounter with oneself or with another. In regards to early literacy, we see dialogic in its broadest sense. That is not just verbal communication. Alongside this, we see the primary motivators for communicating in young children as being relationships and connections with others, to make meaning together. We both argue that the more opportunities for connection and communication that young children experience, the more empowered they are to value and share their ideas, and importantly, negotiate their thinking with others. There's a diagram here from Smolden and Howell. It's a simple diagram that we think exemplifies the social phenomenon of these complex literacy processes.
And along with Brunner, here's somebody else who knows a lot about stories, children's author Joy Cowley. And in her book council lecture in 2018, this is how she described her view of stories: as a form of communication, as a way of documenting our histories, a way of learning about other people through their stories, and as a way of forming our identities. And stories are also recognised as being important forms of connection and communication, of course, in Te Whāriki, with learning outcomes that centre on children experiencing the stories of their own and other cultures. And here are some examples of goals and learning outcomes from the communication and belonging strands that I'm sure you'll be familiar with. So overall, stories are an important part of learning, and they're interwoven into children's everyday lives. So I'm going to move on to telling you a little bit about my study now, which focuses on one-year-old toddlers. And there's actually very little research on the story experiences of one-year-old children in New Zealand, especially in early childhood education settings, even though we know that around 50% of all one-year-olds in New Zealand attend some form of early childhood education, and in our communities that are becoming increasingly diverse. So the main aim of my study was to explore how one-year-olds in a culturally and linguistically diverse community of New Zealand experience stories across their homes and early childhood centres. And within that overarching aim, I had three research questions. Firstly, I wanted to know what were the kinds of stories that one-year-olds experienced in this community? How did they participate in stories with others, and what were the story roles that people played? And thirdly, how was intersubjectivity, or those shared moments of meaning, accomplished during story interactions? So this was a qualitative case study in a diverse community of New Zealand that involved 2 early childhood centres and 8 families, 4 families in each centre. And the families represented a range of cultures in this community, including Māori, Samoan, Filipino, Indian, Middle Eastern, German and Irish, and all the families spoke at least one language other than English at home, reflecting their cultural ties to other parts of the world. I carried out visits to the early childhood centres 2 to 3 times a week and visited families at home over a period of 9 months. And in one of the centres, one of the teachers came with me on the home visits to her families. I interviewed the parents and all 7 of the teachers, and I gradually introduced video to record the story interactions as they naturally occurred in both the homes and early childhood settings. In gathering and analysing the information, I used a combined approach called multimodal ethnography. And multimodal ethnography combines 2 lenses that helped me to understand the story interactions. Firstly, through multimodal analysis of how people communicate in specific ways, including their body language, their gestures, their eye gaze, and words. And I captured this in the video clips that I took of the story interactions. And secondly, an ethnographic approach. So basically that just meant that I spent a long time in this community, or 9 months. So as a researcher, I came to understand how stories unfolded in the context of people's lives and relationships. And later I'm going to share an example of how I used both of these lenses to help me understand one child's story. So here's an overview of what I learned about stories in this community. Firstly, that there were many different ways that stories were shared with 1-year-olds. This is what I observed, and this is what kayako and parents described when I interviewed them. Secondly, that toddlers played multiple roles during story interactions involving them not just as listeners, but also as sharers or tellers of stories. And thirdly, that stories involved multimodal communication, involving much more than just talk and reading print. And I'll explain that a little bit more in a minute. But one thread woven throughout all 3 findings was that relationships were at the heart of story interactions. So here are some examples of the kinds of stories I observed 1-year-olds taking part in, and I'm sure that as kayako, you will recognise many of these. So there were conversational stories about everyday experiences that often related to people, places and things that were familiar to children. And these often took place within the everyday moments like meal times. And down the bottom there, sometimes technology was involved. There's an example of a mum scrolling through photos on her phone as they reminisce and retell stories of things that happened to them that they did as a family. There were also oral stories shared person to person. For example, families talked about folk tales and legends from their cultures, as well as Bible stories, sometimes with morals to be learned. And these were often passed down from generation to generation as stories that were told or acted out. And of course, with 1-year-olds, many of the stories involved music, like action songs and rhyme. Sometimes with props like musical instruments, poi, costumes, pictures, puppets. And again, there were many stories shared through music that involved children's home languages. So again, that linked with their cultural heritage. Stories were also shared through dance and movement and gesture. Even the karakia before kai time, you can see down the bottom left, children always did the actions before they ate their kai, and often those prayers told a kind of story. And actions as people read books with children down the bottom right as well made the stories come alive. And this was a really good reminder to me as to how holistic and sensory infants and toddlers are in their learning, and their learning about literacy. They wanted to explore things with their bodies through touching, through putting things in their mouths. And they wanted to move. So I think sometimes it gets quickly channeled with sitting and looking and listening and not touching the person beside you. So it was a good reminder of how holistic and sensory literacy was for these 1-year-old children. And of course, stories were also enacted through play, all kinds of symbolic play. But with the 1-year-olds, I often saw them starting to act things out through role play, through making noises, through moving objects. And sometimes this was just children on their own without adults directly involved. Up the top left, that aspect of tuakana taina, where toddlers were watching one another and playing together as they acted out stories in that way, but often with adults involved too. And of course, books were definitely an important form of story sharing in this community in both homes and early childhood centres. But there were many different types of books, mostly picture books with the 1-year-old toddlers, often with the lift, the flat books, often homemade or the usual commercial books. At home, families talked about photo albums, children loving seeing themselves in the photos, and similarly in the learning stories, when they could access the hard copies in the centres. There were dual language books and Bible stories. So lots of different kinds of books shared with the children. And 1-year-olds also had opportunities to learn how to express themselves in storied ways by experimenting, playing with writing tools and other creative media like Play-Doh, clay and water. But these photos show examples of children making marks on paper. And teachers talked about sometimes, even with the 1-year-olds, they understood that those marks were symbolic, like putting a scribble up the top corner of a page symbolised their name. On the right-hand side, there's a photo of a teacher playing with children with the window chalks as she sang the wheels on the bus. So the wheels go round and round. They were doing the circles, the dots for the horn, and the people going up and down with the lines. So just lots of playful ways that were incorporated with music. And this was also linked with early expression through writing. So I hope that gives you an overview and a sense of how broadly and diversely stories with 1-year-olds were defined and observed in this community. And perhaps you can identify with some of these from your own centres too. So now I'm going to zoom in on one particular story belonging to a child called Lexi, who was 16 months old. And this was a story that was supported by her relationships across her home and early childhood centre. And it took place within lunchtime interactions and related to Lexi's experience of eating her lunch. This story shows how 1-year-olds can be competent in helping to tell their stories, even if they are not yet using many spoken words. This story was an example of a personal story, which I've defined here as purposeful expressions of meaning related to past, present, or future experiences, with a context, plot, or characters that have some personal relevance to the teller or listener, and that might take place in face-to-face or physically distant interactions. So this is Lexi's story shown. This shows the sequence of her story in a story map, if you like. So Lexi's parents and her teacher, Ara, shared this story with me in their interviews, and I also observed some of it during my visits to the centre. The story began when Lexi's parents told teacher, Ara, that they were concerned that Lexi was not eating much at home, and their aspiration for her was to eat and enjoy her food. So Ara responded by encouraging and supporting Lexi to feel comfortable about trying a little food when she was at the centre with her friends. During one lunchtime, when Ara saw that Lexi was enjoying eating, she captured the moment on video using her phone in selfie mode, and then she sent it to Lexi's mother straight away. And the same thing happened again 3 days later. I happened to be there with my camera on both occasions, so I also took video clips of the interactions. And when Ara and I visited Lexi's family at home, we watched those video clips and discussed them together. During the interviews, Lexi's parents and Ara also highlighted the special relationship that they shared because, like the family, Ara was also from the Philippines. Firstly, they talked about their shared Filipino culture and identity. They talked about their shared experience of immigrating to New Zealand from the Philippines a few years earlier. They spoke the same languages, including Tagalog, the national language of the Philippines, as well as English. And they also shared certain cultural understandings and expectations. For example, Lexi's parents referred to Ara as ate, which means auntie or older sister in Tagalog, which reflects not only their respect for her, but also that she was regarded as being a part of their family. And finally, Ara was also Lexi's key teacher. So she had been aware of the parents' concerns about her eating for some time, and she was keen to support their aspirations. And in this respect, Ara talked about the importance of Te Whāriki in guiding her practices around sustaining children's home languages and cultures, plus recognising family aspirations. And this story is one example of how Ara incorporated those practices as an infant toddler teacher at her centre. So back to the story, Ara now I'm going to show you 2 video transcripts of the lunchtime interactions. So these multimodal transcripts allow us to zoom in on the detail of how Lexi and Ara communicated together to let her mother know that she was eating. So this slide relates to a segment of the first video clip that I took. And you can see the modes of body action, eye gaze, speech and vocalizations are shown across the top for each person. We can see in this clip that Ara speaks to Lexi in English, encouraging Lexi to tell her mother that she's eating while she takes a video of her in selfie mode using her phone. And Lexi responds. She contributes to the story by smiling at the phone screen, shifting her eye gaze, waving, tilting her head, blowing kisses, while she says mama and bye-bye, while taking a big bite of the corn. This is an excerpt of the second clip that I took 3 days later. And this time, Ara speaks to Lexi in Tagalog, their home language. Lexi uses no verbal language this time in this clip, but again, she smiles, she looks at the screen, she raises her eyebrows playfully while purposefully taking a bite of the corn. So bringing all of this together, let's think about how Lexi and Ara co-constructed these story episodes together. Using multimodal ethnography and video, I was able to literally zoom in on the detailed signs of communication used by Lexi and Ara, shown on the left, that were situated in their shared understandings and trusting relationship, shown on the right. And using both of these lenses together provided a unique understanding of the story. Zooming in, we can see that both Lexi and Ara used visual, spatial, tactile, auditory and oral combinations of modes. And taking a multimodal perspective allows us to notice and recognise Lexi's role in helping to tell the story, even though she used few words. Ara used verbal language in both English and Tagalog, which was an important cultural resource for Lexi's family and Ara. And while Lexi used few words, she actively participated through her body actions, her eye contact, and her gestures. And zooming out, we could understand more about the context and social relationships. So Ara was able to make sense of Lexi's subtle actions and cues because she shared a close relationship with the family, and they told her about their concerns about Lexi's eating because they trusted her and they could express themselves freely in Tagalog, their home language. So while it looks on the surface like this was just a story about Lexi eating lunch, Ara knew that it was a significant moment and she grasped the opportunity to help Lexi share it straight away with her mother. And as Lexi's key teacher, Ara also knew her well. She knew how to read Lexi's cues and how much to step in to support her so that Lexi could competently participate front and centre to share this story with Ara's help. So what are the implications here for kaiako who work with our youngest tamariki? Firstly, I think it's important to think broadly about the many different kinds of stories that might exist in our communities. And stories with one-year-olds are diverse, whole body experiences, and they happen in everyday moments and within social relationships with others. Secondly, I think kaiako play a really important role in building relationships with children and families. And it's these relationships that make it possible to understand families' aspirations and to recognise those opportunities for stories during the everyday moments, like eating lunch. And while we can't all share the same languages and cultural backgrounds with each and every child and family, it's still possible to learn from families about their cultures and the kinds of stories that they share. Thirdly, this story shows that one-year-old children have competencies in contributing to the telling of stories, but when children are not yet talking, it's really easy to miss their subtle signs and cues. So therefore, recognising children's competencies as storytellers also depends on kaiako being tuned in to their multimodal signals and cues, not just verbal talk. And it's through those warm, attuned relationships that it's possible to build up a picture of patterns that are unique to that infant or toddler, and to recognise children's signs as being valid and meaningful contributions. And of course, one important theme throughout is that relationships are at the heart of story interactions with one-year-old children. When we know children well, we can interpret their signs of meaning, and then we can uncover their competencies and potential as storytellers well before they can talk or read. So thank you very much for listening. I want to thank the families and teachers in my study for allowing me to share their stories today. Here are some references if you would like to know more. And I'm going to hand over to Joanna now to tell you about her research. Thank you.
Now I'm unmuted. Kia ora anō. I was just saying thanks, Amanda, how interesting that was, and to note there's so many crossovers with the things that I've found out as well, although it's a different age group. So moving into the preschool years, the aim of my study was to find out what was happening in the shared thinking space of teacher-child storybook interactions with 3- and 4-year-old children in licensed early childhood settings. My focus was on how and what conceptual thinking and talking teachers might be mediating during these interactions, but today I'll share findings and considerations about the role of relationships and connection during teacher-child storybook interactions and strengthening relationships and in turn language and literacy opportunities in centres. The study design was qualitative and it was across 2 early childhood settings. Sociocultural theories of cognitive psychology, principally Vygotsky's social mediation of language and thinking, and Flair's conceptual and contextual intersubjectivity underpinned the study. Both align with Te Whāraki's position that children learn through reciprocal relationships with people, places and things. And obviously Te Whāraki's key principle of relationships runs throughout. I've got a bell to tell Amanda to move. Okay. It is the talk around the storybook that gives it the power, helping children to bridge what is in the story and in their own lives. So whilst over 20 years old, this quote is powerful in the sense that it sums up really why I chose the storybook space. I've said before, storybooks are an intersubjective shared thinking and talking space, so that was one reason. In theories of learning and development from a sociocultural perspective, books are a semiotic or psychological tool that mediate in the interplay of language, thinking and relationships. Storybooks allow for connections between a child's lived experiences and the story, thus expanding their conceptual thinking and talking in meaningful ways. And importantly, rich narrative storybooks are semantically and lexically more complex than everyday conversation, which exposes children to complex language models and ideas. And lastly, we really need to know more about what's happening in this space in our early childhood centres. And so I wanted to find out. Overall, this case study was particularly interested in the extra textual talk that happens beyond the story and the concepts that teachers may intentionally or unintentionally be mediating during these interactions. However, today I'll focus on the role of relationships and connections and communication about storybooks and how this may affect language and literacy opportunities. With my data, the first inquiry I had was how teachers conceptualize their roles during storybook interactions with children. Thematic analysis revealed 3 themes, and the quotes here show a sense of how teachers saw these roles. Being responsive to relationships with children, they enjoy having that closeness with the teacher, having that close bond. Being responsive to relationships with children involved opportunities for making connections with children, teacher availability to sit and read aloud, and teachers being present to respond to social emotional cues from children. All of the teachers in the study spoke of these reasons being their main motivations for smaller group and one-to-one storybook reading. During larger group mat time storybook interactions, their lens of responsiveness tended to centre on fairness, everyone having a turn to speak. Being responsible for management, organisation and routines. To justify it, like you almost feel you have to. Am I being lazy? And one head teacher questioned, why do we stop and start our day? This involved teachers taking responsibility for the management of groups, the running of routines and the organisation of the environment. Included were responsibilities to their teaching team and centre ways of being around storybook interactions. This resulted in teachers constantly negotiating tensions and balancing priorities. Some teachers commented that despite enjoying reading children to books, they rarely did so outside of mat time, as there was always something else to do, or it might be seen as lazy and therefore difficult to justify. Being educative about curriculum goals was about teachers sharing books with children that explored an idea that teachers wanted the children to think about. Typically, this happened at mat time, where entertaining books were often chosen to mediate the curriculum goal of enjoying books and stories together. Often pro-social books were chosen where behavioural expectations were mediated. During these times, messages about learning to sit on the mat with others, waiting for a turn to speak, in small group or one-to-one interactions, these educative concepts were not planned and tended to centre more on socio-emotional priorities and relationships, or something that might come up with the child in the moment. Sorry, I'm just trying to move this on. The second area of inquiry that I had was how teachers' knowledge affected their storybook interactions with children. Thematic analysis revealed 4 themes in this area. These were child knowledge, own practice knowledge, domain knowledge, and pedagogical knowledge. Child knowledge was about a teacher's knowledge about a child and how this might enrich their interaction. The quote here from a small group interaction shows how the teacher recognised an opportunity to link an idea in a storybook to a recent lived experience she had shared with 2 children present. So this teacher had taken the children on a school visit. They were reading the book, The Little Yellow Digger Goes to School, and interestingly, it was chosen by the 2 children who were starting school the following week. You can see the quote as an example of how she makes a connecting link between the children's lives and the happenings in the storybook. Child knowledge was also about teacher knowledge of relationships as curriculum. This is also seen here with the teacher's recognition of the power of these connecting links between the child and the storybook as a mechanism to strengthen comprehension and meaning making as well as connection. In this way, the storybook interaction becomes a rich and attuned thinking space for extra-textual thinking and talk. Lastly, child knowledge included teachers' knowledge about a child's interest in books or reading together, and knowledge of the child's strategies during these interactions. And this is really interesting to observe. It included children's inclinations or not to engage in any talk beyond the story. I observed some interesting examples with this. With one child, whenever the teacher looked to be distracted by another child or by something else in the environment, he would point to something random on the page and say, "Read that." Beyond these imperatives, he said very little to her, but sat close, suggesting that his motivation was more relational than the story itself. The second area that the third and fourth themes are still being finalised, domain knowledge and pedagogical knowledge, but I wanted to speak to some of these because I think they're really important. Domain knowledge includes teachers' knowledge of types of talk, exploratory and explanatory talk, that is, talk that opens up a discussion rather than contains and explains. Likewise, knowledge about decontextualized versus semantically contingent talk, that is, talk that requires children to think beyond their lived experience as extending rather than talk that relies on concrete prior knowledge. Although both are important, it is interesting to note teachers' understanding of both. Domain knowledge also includes teachers' knowledge about the power of talk beyond the storybook and storybooks themselves as tools for mediating language, thinking and talking. And of course, it includes teachers' knowledge of concepts about print and early literacy concepts. Pedagogical knowledge involves teachers' knowledge and awareness of their strategies for extending thinking and talking, their storybook selection and their location of interactions. Also, their use of storybooks in planning and assessment. Pedagogical knowledge also explored teachers' knowledge about how children construct conceptual understandings and how they might support this during their interactions. Thus far, the evidence shows 4 important findings that I think are worth pointing out today. Teachers were not forthcoming regarding domain knowledge about storybooks, language, and literacy. That's not to say they didn't have the knowledge, they were just not very forthcoming about it. Teachers were hesitant to engage in structured or teacher-led activity outside of routine times. Teachers noted in hindsight where they could have extended a dialogue or an idea during a storybook interaction, but didn't think to do so at the time. Again, not necessarily because they didn't have the knowledge to, but perhaps because of other competing priorities. And teachers prioritised pro-social and behavioural messages in storybooks, and that was evident throughout the things they did choose to pick up on when they did. So as expected, context played a huge part in storybook interactions, and the quote here sums it up well. So at mat time, there's that sort of entertainment quality, but when it's one-to-one or a small group, it's more just about connection. Teachers and children had different experiences and expectations of engagement, participation and agency. A typical comparison saw the teacher-led large group mat time shared storybook interactions were routine and intended as educative across literacy and behavioural concepts, whereas one-to-one or small group storybook interactions were intimate, informal and more responsive to social emotional concepts and experiential connections. Interestingly, location had an effect too. In the setting where there were 3 couches in various spaces, there were notably more small group storybook interactions with a teacher. The other setting had one small, hard, child-sized 2-seater couch, and I rarely saw adults sitting on it. So storybooks at mat time. These quotes show the ways teachers saw their role during storybooks at mat time. They saw their role as meeting routine and curriculum requirements. They tended to choose books that were humorous or entertaining to meet the curriculum goal of enjoying books together and also to manage the group. Sometimes they chose books in response to a perceived pro-social need of a child or a group of children. For example, being kind, being a good friend, sharing and helping out. Popular books were relatable events like birthday parties and popular culture, particularly superheroes. As anticipated, the dominance of teacher talk during mat time storybook interactions was significantly limited opportunities for back and forth dialogue. Children's contributions were generally restricted to hands up rules and singular comments, in fairness to give everyone who wanted to speak a turn and to keep on task with the story. Typically, children who commented off task would be ignored or asked to keep their comments connected to the story or question. This was a managerial constraint commented on by all the teachers in the study. The familiar traditional school classroom IRE model of teacher initiation, child response, and teacher evaluation did not open up space for talk. Instead, it reinforces the concepts of being correct, only speaking if you know the answer or are asked to speak, and also how to behave in a large group. For the purposes of time today, I've not included a mat time example, as I feel that you are quite typical with how they are, but I have some that are of interest if you would like to get in touch with me later. Storybooks with a small group or one-to-one were understandably quite different. And I think these quotes show the relational priorities for children and for teachers. The small group storybook interactions were responsive, informal, and often child-led. Children usually selected the books and employed interesting strategies to extend the interactions, like grabbing a new book as soon as one had finished, turning a page, pointing to a picture, or ignoring a question from the teacher that they might see as an interruption, or perhaps might see as interrogative. These interactions typically came about in response to requests or reading to settle or comfort a child. In these interactions, socio-emotional priorities dominated teachers' minds. In the following one-to-one example, the child had arrived late and the rest of the group were all ready at mat time. In addition to this, he noted his two friends were not there, so he became quite upset. The teacher offered to read him a story, and as she started reading it, realised that it connected very well with his feelings. They sat close together on a large, comfortable couch. While the child said nothing throughout the interaction, he looked at her and the book often. This interaction was intersubjective, and she was intentionally framing socio-emotional concepts about sadness and friendships that the child was likely thinking about. Because the teacher knew the child well, she knew not to expect much in the way of a verbal response from him, but his non-verbal cues of snuggling in, watching the book intently, were evidence of his connection with her and likely with the relatable concepts in the story. I've underlined the connecting links in her extra-textual talk to see how she bridged the storybook with the child's world. He just needed that one-to-one personalised attention, the teacher said. My Friend Bear by Jazz Olbra. This boy here, his name is Eddie, and his teddy bear's name is Freddie. We've got a Freddie at kindy. Oh, Freddie, said Eddie with a big sigh. I feel sad and I don't know why. He feels sad, just like you, but he doesn't know why. Freddie said nothing and he sighed again. I wish you could talk, he said. And then, look up on that stone, a giant teddy all on his own. That is big. He's as big as a tree. We've seen him before. He belongs to the bear who lives in the woods somewhere. Suddenly, something made Eddie turn round. A snuffling and a scuffling sort of sound. A big voice whined, "Where's my teddy? He's coming, he's coming. We'd better hide." Oh, where's he going to hide? Oh, there he is. He's decided to hide behind Big Teddy. The big bear came shuffling by. This is Big Teddy, and this is Big Bear, a real bear. He's very big. And look, he's crying just like you were crying because he's sad, just like you, Addie. He's feeling sad too. Oh, Teddy, he said, what can I do? I've got no friends. We have that sometimes, don't we? What's interesting in this vignette is that although the teacher did all of the talking, asked and answered her own questions, the interaction was still attuned and the teacher could reasonably assume what the child was thinking about. She left small pauses for him to answer her questions or consider them, but respected that he was just content to listen and cuddle. There are also academic concepts of size and comparison and associated vocabulary, as well as concepts about print, like text, print, links, and these are embedded in the story and reinforced by the teacher in her extra textual talk. She also supports them by pointing, voice, and gesture. The teacher spent a lot of time looking directly at him when she asked questions or commented, and she reinforced her messages with hugs and smiles. So what are the key considerations for teaching arising for this study? First and foremost, it's important to note that both teachers and children were primarily motivated by connection, and whilst reluctant to talk about literacy in its structured and teacher-led ways, they were aware of relationships as vital for communication and connection. While not discussed overtly by teachers in the study, the evidence suggests that they intuitively knew the importance of bridging connections between the storybooks and the children's lived experiences to support comprehension and to extend meaning making. Lillian Katz spoke of children learning to understand and negotiate the varied and changing social, relational aspects of their worlds as intellectual learning. In this way, she didn't want to separate social or academic conceptual learning. She called the intellectual learning substantial and complex and not to be underestimated as rich learning. So I guess what I'm trying to say here is if relationships are underpinning everything we do, this in itself is rich conceptual learning. Teachers' multiple conceptualizations of their role and their varying experiences and knowledges show the complexities they face in their moment-by-moment decision-making and priorities. Powerfully, these decisions shape both their own and the children's behaviour around sharing books together. This mutual shaping of behaviour is an area I want to investigate further. Excuse me. It relates to how both past experiences plus centre ways and expectations about books mediate how both children and teachers behave and how interactions unfold. Finally, I'm interested in the limited visibility of storybooks as curriculum experience outside of mat time. It was very telling that in both settings on a very rainy day, where children were inside all day, I saw a lot more storybook interactions, and this was among teachers and among children themselves. Other more active and outdoor activities are prioritised. Why is that? And is there a playbook binary? There are many other questions I have, but I'll end here, and I hope this has given you some things to consider in your daily practice and research. Here are the references I drew on today, and I'd just like to say thank you to both the early childhood centres who participated in this study, and I'll hand back over to you. Thank you for listening, Amanda. Oh, and here's our
Joanna. Yeah, this was our final slide, which we they're all points that we've touched on across both of our studies, but they're things that we have in common. And we started with the whakatoki here, ko te reo, te taikura o te whakaro marama. And really, I think it's come up in both of our presentations about the importance of connection and communication, about teachers knowing children well, and being able to recognise and respond to multiple modes of communication, not just spoken language, sorry. Building those bridges and connecting links between the known and the unknown. And of course, you know, that means creating space for kaiako and children to extend those interactions, and empowering languages to extend children's thinking and talking. So thank you very much. And sorry, I'm having problems with my clicker. Here we go.
Yeah, I have problems with mine.
Here's our contact details. If you would like to carry on the conversation today, please don't hesitate to get in touch. But if you have any questions now, we would love to hear them also. Thank you.
Yeah, kia ora, there are some questions, and thank you both very much. You've given us some really great food for thought. I think that's another whakatauki that could have come through. So one of the first questions that popped up was around your presentation, Amanda, and Marianne would like to know how you selected your settings and participants.
That's a really good question. It took some time. It was a purposive sample, so I wanted to make sure that I had a group, that I had a community that reflected a wide range of cultures. And so I took some time, first of all, to find the centres, looking at their ERO reports and talking to ex-colleagues who knew the centres. And then I approached about 6 and visited them all and spoke to the centre managers until I found the 2 centres that between both of the centres I had enough 1-year-olds who would reflect those ranges of cultures. And then in terms of selecting the 8 families, I took time to do that as well. I spent quite a bit of time in the centres just being there to get to know people. And once I'd been there for a while, the teachers guided me to help choose or approach families who might be interested in taking part. So that was 4 in each centre. So they really helped me to select the families.
Thank you. And just following up with that too, something that's come through very clearly in your presentation is around the relationships and knowing children. And you answered one of the questions that I was thinking about was with Ara sharing Lexi's background and her languages, you know, what advice you had when that wasn't shared. And you said that could be addressed via getting to know families. But I know that you used home visits, and I just wondered if you'd like to comment on that, because that's something that Maria Cooper and I have championed through our research, you know, that even where centres think they know families well, just how much richer it can become. So I just wondered if you wanted to comment on that.
Well, I drew on the work that you did, Cooper and Teachers 2014. And the tips that you have at the end, really practical tips for researchers and for kayako if you want to sort of know how to get started with home visits. But I think, really, really valuable to do that. And for Ara to come with me, and she commented that even though she knew the families quite well already, she saw different aspects of them through visiting them at home, and particularly with the 1-year-olds, just the little things around how they're settled at home, the things that they're interested in, the kinds of TV programs or books that they have at home, even just for her to observe those and to make those connections and links, I think she said was really valuable. So
yeah, really powerful. So thank you. Thank you very much. Okay, Joanna, a couple of questions for you. Firstly, you threw in a comment of a teacher saying, why do we stop and start our day? And so Michelle has asked if you could just explain a little more about what that was about, please.
It was actually a passing comment, but I just found it interesting because I was in an interview with a teacher, and we were talking about some of the reasons behind why this may or may not have happened this way. And the teacher another teacher who was passing was actually the head teacher of that setting, sort of must have heard some of it. And she just said, yes, why do we stop and start our day? And I think it was a rhetorical question, because obviously things have to happen across a day, but I think she was alluding to the idea that if we could just let things unfold the way children wanted them to, there could be so much more richness in what sort of comes forward from that. But so that was essentially what it meant. But I thought it was quite a powerful question.
Yes, I agree. And because one of the things I was thinking about was what were the constraints that were influencing those 4 findings that you had. And I could see that that quote might have fitted in quite well with that. There's been a bit of conversation in the chat about the map times, as you might expect. I wondered if you could just elaborate a little bit more on what you're feeling about the limitations of what you saw. And there is one particular question about whether you think the size of the book makes a difference in terms of map time as well. So just perhaps elaborate on your limitations of map time a little bit more.
The size as in the length?
No, I think.
Oh, right.
Big books.
Oh, a big book, yeah.
I'm interpreting that, but that's the way I would hear it.
Yeah. Well, I guess if the group is very large, then size is a factor because of not everyone being able to see the detail in the pictures. So what was the essence of the question? What?
Did you want to elaborate a little bit more on the limitations of map time? For example, you had a quote there about being an entertainment idea. You also talked about how there was, it tended to be used for social emotional concepts, social competence, and or literacy concepts. So were there other missed opportunities that you might want to comment on?
Yeah, I use the word pro-social rather than social-emotional because I felt that at that time it was more sort of pro-social, sort of almost like a deficit kind of we need to work on being better friends or helping to share, or not that that's a negative thing, but social-emotional I saw as more responsive to an individual child's social emotional cues. I think the limitations, and all of the teachers spoke to this, is just the reality of trying to manage a large group. If they tried to do something too fun and too interactive, it would sort of not work out for them because it would then be very, very difficult to control. So for example, interactive books, all of the children would want to have a turn, and it just can get a bit chaotic, for want of a better word. Likewise, if people want to contribute ideas, they may get to do that, but it tended to be with hands up, because the reality was if a child went off in another direction, A, they weren't sort of necessarily taking the group with them, and B, the teacher had asked a question about something else. So it was like kind of this little, I liked that quote, a little bit of a dance, because while that would shut down that opportunity for that child to explore her thinking, there was also everyone else to think about. So I don't think it was, I certainly didn't see it as bad teaching. I think it's just the reality of children that age with a large group. And yeah, so the expectations of sharing a storybook at that time have to be different, which is why I think the pro-social and perhaps literacy concepts got focused on more, because there wasn't that opportunity to sort of go off on a tangent and dialogue about something else.
Right, good. Thank you, and thank you both. I can see from the chat and the questions coming up too, there's going to be a lot of reflection and ongoing discussion in many early childhood centres as a result of what you've shared. So I'm just going to hand back to Justine now to do what we call the thank and wrap. And yeah, what's next? Thanks, Justine.
Kia ora. So thank you so much, Joanna and Amanda, for the presentation of your research this evening. You've reminded us all of the incredible power and importance of stories in building and maintaining relationships, and have reminded me of a quote by the author Philip Pullman, where he says that without stories, we wouldn't be human beings at all. So ngā mihi nui kia korua. So we hope that you've all found this seminar thought-provoking and that it has provided inspiration for your own practice. For those of you who, I know several people have asked if they can have copies of the PowerPoint slides, if you're really desperate, please do email Joanna and Amanda. But do remember that this presentation is available for you on the Early Childhood Seminar Series YouTube channel, so you can revisit it as many times as you would like in the future. And we hope to see you again for our next seminar on October the 18th. So Natalie Hopper and myself will be sharing from our research studies exploring early childhood teacher wellbeing. But in the meantime, kia kaha, kia ora, kia ata whai, ka kite anō.
Ka kite.